Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Event Icons. Will Curran from Endless Events here, back again. And today's topic is at the top of so many people's minds. The way I've been kind of describing the event planner's mind right now, 50% is tuned into can I convert my event into a virtual event. The other 50% is figuring out how can I recover all my revenue from my in-person events. So today we're going to bring on the master, the myth, the legend, Josh Grimes, who's going to talk to you from a legal standpoint. When you're canceling an event, what should you be doing, and all that jazz. So if you're ready to rock and roll, give me a shout in the chat room and let's get this week's episode of Event Icons rolling.
It's Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, so you know what that means. It's time for another episode of #Event Icons, presented by Endless Events. The show where you get to ask the icons of the events industry anything. Just go to www.event-icons.com to ask questions. Our iconic guests will answer them live during the entire show. Before we get started, the more people we have watching, the better the conversation. So please help share #Event Icons on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just tell your friends to watch at www.event-icons.com. Now, without any further delay, this is #Event Icons.
Well, like I said, we're talking about legal cancellations of events and all that sort of stuff. And let's be honest, I'm not a legal expert in any sort of way. I don't play a lawyer on TV, but I do know one of the smartest mans when it comes to this sort of thing is the man, the myth, the legend, as I said, the attorney, Josh Grimes, in the house. Josh, thank you so much for joining us here today for Event Icons and getting to share all the legal advice, the ones we can, which we'll talk about in a sec, for everyone that's tuning in today. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
No, thanks. Well, pleasure to be here, except I'm going to spend the next hour trying to live up to that introduction. So thank you.
No, surely you will be able to. For everyone who is tuning in right now, Josh is an incredible attorney for the events industry. I'm going to give him a chance to give his introduction and say what his background and what got him to where he is. But before we do that, I think we do need a little bit of a disclaimer before we jump into this. So Josh, give everyone a little bit of feedback, disclaimer if they're listening to this or watching this before they dive on in.
Right. So the disclaimer is since I'm not wearing a suit and tie right now, it means I'm not in my lawyer mode. I'm in my education mode. And anything that we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about what you all want to talk about for the next hour, this is general advice and guidance, but it shouldn't be considered legal advice, which I can only give out in an attorney-client relationship, and you should only receive from an attorney that's competent in the meeting industry who you might want to consult with. So let's talk about what you want to talk about, but it's general educational advice.
Awesome. So as we get started and Josh tells us his story about what got him in the events industry, post in the comments down below what questions that you have, what things are on the top of your mind, what's worrying you right now, and we're going to be able to ask those questions directly to Josh. I think this is one of the few times that you can say that you get a lawyer basically for free for the next hour or so. So, this is time valuably spent. So, yeah. All right, Josh, well, tell us, I think it's incredible because you're not just an attorney. You are very much focused on the events industry, and you have a lot of knowledge in the events industry. So what got you to where you are today and kind of being an attorney and focusing on law specifically for events?
Right. Well, always was interested in travel and events and things like that. And now, boy, a long time ago, maybe almost 25, 30 years ago, I worked after a few years of practicing law. I worked for the mayor of Philadelphia, who later became governor of Pennsylvania, Ed Rendell, when the Pennsylvania Convention Center was opening. So he got me involved in all of the opening legal matters with the Convention Center and other festivals and events the city of Philadelphia did. When I segued back into private practice, I decided I wanted to focus in this area. This is now 23 years ago. Started with hotels. Initially, I exclusively represented hotels, but the demand quickly came in for work with planners. So I've always done both, but probably 80% of my practice is on the planner side now and the meeting side rather than the hotel side. So in a long story, I started my own practice in 1996, based in Philadelphia, but I have clients all over the country and frankly around the world. have been speaking for MPI, PCMA, Connect meetings, other groups for almost 20 years. I've spoken for probably well over 100, 125 MPI meetings in particular. And this is where it is years later. So I'm an overnight success that's taken a crisis like this, unfortunately, to become popular.
Yeah, no, totally, totally. I think it has been very much apparent that everyone realized they needed attorneys. I think when they all went through this. So let's dive into this a little bit and kind of unpack it, because I think a lot of people are worried: is my contract strong enough for me to be able to be able to hold on to my cancellation? I think a lot of planners are worried: how can I get out of these hotel contracts I have? I know a lot of it's multifaceted, but I
Mhm.
think there's some terms that are very important for people to understand in relationship to a contract. And so, can you kind of define the difference? And I've been hearing this term flying around a lot: is force majeure versus cancellation. What do people have to know about the difference between the two, and why is it important?
Well, okay, force majeure is a legal term that's been around for a long time, and it's in your contracts, but it's separate from your contracts. What a force majeure is a legal principle that says if it becomes impossible to perform or illegal to perform, then both sides can go their separate ways, and there's no liability for either side. And almost every statute and every country, excuse me, almost every country in the world has, and every state has a force majeure provision either built into their law or in their legal tradition. And most countries have it outside of the US too. So there's a strict force majeure principle out there. Now, what we've done in the meetings industry is broaden that. We've said we don't want to just there shouldn't just be cancellation if it's impossible or illegal to have a meeting, but we talk about, is it impractical to have a meeting? Is it commercially impracticable? That's the word you use. Is it inadvisable? And we've built in a whole number of contractual provisions that frankly are much broader than a strict force majeure clause would be, but they let planners and groups get out of meeting contracts, or frankly any kind of supplier contracts too, if they meet certain criteria. And if you have a contractual provision in your meeting contract that's broader than a force majeure law, that meeting contract provision will almost always be upheld. So that's really the difference.
Totally makes sense. So then, where does it come into play? Where, if, for example, someone's contract says something like, "Hey, 2 weeks out from the event, you owe us this amount of money." Does force majeure have priority, or does the cancellation policy, or is it whoever has the best lawyer?
Yeah, we'd like to say that whoever hires me, right? It's really that the contractual provision for cancellation damages, which we see in every contract, shouldn't apply for a force majeure. So if you've got those typical scales, if you cancel 180 days out, you pay this amount of damages. You cancel 90 days out, you pay this amount, that sort of thing. That usually only applies if someone walks away from the meeting and cancels for convenience for any reason, or because a party defaults, they're not performing their obligations. A force majeure only applies where someone can't perform because of a reason outside of its control. So, for instance, if I say, well, we have a new CEO in our company and he wants to tighten the belt, so we're canceling. That's not a force majeure because that's within the control of the group that's canceling. A force majeure, and it's hard to have an exhaustive list because we don't know what's going to happen, but terrorism. And it's never a bright line usually. Is it terrorism just in the city where your meeting is going to be? Or is it terrorism for some groups? If there's a terrorism in Europe, people might not want to get on an airplane and travel. So maybe that's a force majeure for that group. Bad weather might be a force majeure, but is really bad heat going to be a force majeure if your meeting's in Scottsdale in July or August? Probably not. So the key is to define things as narrowly as possible or as broadly as possible for a force majeure, because we don't like things to go to court, but if it ever did, a judge is going to take a hard look at your clause and see if what's there actually is a force majeure. Without just one other quick example that we have right now with coronavirus. Well, when the CDC issues an advisory, we're kind of beyond this now, but for the CDC only issues advisories. They don't tell you not to travel. But if they issue an advisory saying, do not travel outside of the United States, is that a force majeure, or do you need a government mandate, a government order telling you not to go? So these are the kind of minutia we deal with these clauses.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, the questions are starting to flood on in,
Are
Josh.
we here?
So a lot of great questions. I do want to give some shout outs to everybody who's watching so far. Scott Weingart for TMN Events, Peter Berliner, Mark Howell here as well, Greg Cornell, Kim Culver, Kate Brown. Oh my gosh. Kimberly, Gerardo, back again, Mike James, everybody who's tuning on in. Thank you guys so much. So the question that we're kind of getting so far. So Kim Culver on LinkedIn asks, what if we don't have a force majeure clause in our contract?
You're not out of luck totally. Again, as I said before, it depends on the law that governs your contract, which is usually where your meeting's going to be held. But for instance, if you're meeting in Texas, Texas has a force majeure, what we call a common law provision, I believe there. California is even better example. California has a provision, and I happen to know it's the California Civil Code section 1511 that has circumstances where you can cancel without liability because of unforeseen occurrences outside the control of the parties. So that gives you rights if you have absolutely no force majeure clause. I can't tell you, it depends on the circumstances. I can't tell you it's a slam dunk, but it will probably be helpful for you in a dire circumstance like what we have right now.
That totally makes sense. And Greg Cornell's kind of asking too, like, what if the force majeure doesn't specifically say virus on it as well?
And
Does
they
that
usually
matter
don't.
right now?
Well, it may say government regulation. And right now, what we have, depending on where your meeting is, well, the government has banned in many places gatherings of anywhere from any size group to gatherings of 10 people, 50 people. It depends on the jurisdiction. Some governments have told you, like I'm dealing in Kentucky right now, where they've banned any sort of meeting. And Washington, D.C., I think, is banned. Maybe it's groups of more than, I think it might be 10. So those are government orders that would help you in these circumstances, even if even if you don't have anything about a virus or that sort of thing. Again, read your clauses carefully. Does it include government regulations? Does some of them say act of God or any other unforeseen occurrence outside the control of the parties? Any of those things would be helpful in this circumstance.
That absolutely makes sense. I got another kind of question coming in as well from Scott Weingart in the audience. Asks, what governs how far prior to an event the force majeure can be triggered?
I'm smiling because I just was dealing with this issue probably 2 hours ago with someone. It depends. Some contracts say that if you have a force majeure occurrence, you need to notify the other side that you want to cancel. Let's also remember, force majeure can also be a postponement of a meeting, not just a cancellation. But you have to tell the other side within 10 days of when the force majeure occurrence arose. And if that's in there, that's what it is. Otherwise, I would say you should, as soon as you know. But let's look at the other side. So I'm dealing today with meetings that are going to be at the end of June. And groups are asking me, can we cancel today if a meeting is at the end of June? Well, the answer is, I would say I would wait and see what happens, particularly if there's no penalty to you to waiting. Why? Because right now, most of these government orders against group gatherings and travel and closing convention centers are only in effect until April. And in fact, Las Vegas, as some of you may know, casinos are closed, but only until towards the end of April. And these bans may be extended, but we don't know right now. So can you cancel for June? We may get to June. And particularly if you listen to some people who think I don't particularly think this is going to peak that soon and be great by April. But yesterday or 2 days ago, the president was talking about opening things up by Easter. Well, what if this goes away and it does open up by Easter? If you then have a meeting canceled in June, the force majeure reasons may no longer exist. So I recommend that you wait as long as possible until it's clear. Now, if you have a ban or a government order that says we are not reopening our convention center or our hotels until July 1, then you know now. So it's something different.
Awesome. Oh my gosh. The questions are just falling. Peter Berliner says in the audience, Easter of
Yeah.
what year?
Yeah, I
I
hear
think
you.
that's
I'm not,
very funny.
yeah, well,
I
I'm
know that
trying not to be political.
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. All right. So, Katie Brown in the LinkedIn audience says, "What if a client cancels right before the city institutes a no gathering? Would you be able to claim force majeure?"
In general, it's the facts as they are at the time you cancel. So if you cancel today, and or if you cancel at the beginning of March, you can't generally then claim because after you canceled, the World Health Organization declared a pandemic and there were bans on gathering. Unfortunately, I think it's a tough thing to claim that those are reasons for cancellation that allow a force majeure because you had already canceled. And the facts that are operative are the ones that are on the ground at the time that you canceled. I do have some sympathy for that. I particularly think that, for instance, if you had a meeting in Vegas and you canceled for April 10th and you canceled it on March 10th, and then a week later, the governor declared that all the casinos had to be closed till past April 10th. Well, the casino couldn't have performed either. So shouldn't that be a force majeure? If you want to pay me to make that argument as your lawyer, I'm happy to make that argument. But I think it's a tough one. I think it's usually what it is usually it's the facts at the time you cancel that you have to work with. That's why you should wait as long as possible.
Awesome. Oh my gosh, there's so many questions coming in. This is an
Sorry.
absolute madhouse of questions. This is very, very good. Terry Quick in the audience asked, many companies provide meeting plan services to clients in exchange for hotel commissions. What happens when a client cancels a meeting for force majeure? Do the meeting planners have any recourse for services already rendered for both parties?
Well, the long and the short of it, if it's just a commission contract, the answer would be no, because the commissions are earned. The commissions come in when the meeting happens. And in fact, most hotel contracts will say that they don't pay commissions on cancellation damages or if happens. Two ways to address that. One is to work the commissions based on revenue that the hotel gets, whether it's cancellation damages or not. And I would argue if there are cancellation damages at play, if the hotel is getting 100% of the room rate for each room that is canceled, then they should pay commission. Otherwise, the hotel is getting more money in their pockets than if the group had actually performed. But the other thing is, and I've encouraged planners I work with for a long time to do this, you should, and it's particularly relevant now that it's harder to get 10% commission from hotels. Now we get 7% or less. Planners ought to have an arrangement with the company that hires them. This is obviously for third party planners that recognizes that you do a lot of work before the meeting. And you, of course, you do site visits, you do planning visits, all sorts of planning, registration. You do real work before the meeting, and you deserve to be compensated for that work, whether the meeting happens or not. Many of your clients, the hosts of the meetings, don't really appreciate that because you're might be compensated strictly by commission. So I recommend you have a contract in place that says if the meeting happens, we get commission, but if it doesn't happen, we get our costs and expenses and maybe an hourly rate for employees equal to the amount they did up until the time of cancellation.
Awesome. Wow. I feel like thank you audience for asking so many questions. You guys are making my job so much easier because now I'm just like trying to read through all the questions you have coming in. I'm gonna kick this one over to TJ Jordan over on the LinkedIn Live audience. TJ says we have a contract with a venue in New York City for April 18th for about 50 plus people. They say they can hold our meeting. Well, we want to cancel and receive 100% of our deposit back. how can we legally and safely host our meeting?
Well, okay. I am not specifically, obviously, I'm aware of conditions in New York right now. What I'm not aware of is specifically what the restrictions that the mayor and the governor have put into place. But if there are legal bans, which I'm sure there are, against mass gatherings, and mass gatherings are usually defined to include conventions and things like that. And I'm going to guess in New York now, those bans are what, 10 people, 20 people, if not every gathering just in general of unrelated people or people who don't live together. So if that's the case and it's a law, which I assume that it is, that ought to be a force majeure, particularly if it's either open-ended or it expires after the date of your meeting. Now, when I say is it open-ended, that's a little bit of a tough call, but this is where we look at, you have a meeting. It isn't like the people who are coming to your meeting are just going to decide the day before that they're going to show up, particularly if they're coming from out of town. Even if they have to drive, they have to prepare. So at a certain, and make arrangements to get to the meeting. So at a certain point, we have to say, when does it become impossible to have the meeting? Again, if the ban extends on group gatherings, extends past the date of your meeting, it's an easy case. But even if not, figure out when you can demonstrate that if we don't have anyone, if we can't tell people that they can come to the meeting by April 5th, then that's our drop dead date. Then that's what the date is. And I would work with the venue where you're hosting it and try and reach some accommodation. It may be, and this may not be an option, but it may be that you agree that you're going to postpone the meeting for 6 weeks or 2 months or however long. And if you've paid a deposit, they keep your deposit and apply it to the next meeting. A lot of properties and a lot of venues are doing that right now, and that's a good compromise. But again, I think it's ambitious in Manhattan or in New York to think that you'll be back by the middle of April with a regular meeting.
I think that brings up such a good point too, that you have to almost sometimes find alternative solutions to say, hey, we're going to work together on this as well, and not necessarily come at us just a straight hard and fast scenario, because you might, yeah, like you said, go to the venue and say, what do we have to do to, work together on this as well, like
Right,
you said.
right.
Fantastic, fantastic. Mark Howell has a question for us. What kind of restrictive language should we be careful of? And I'm guessing too that as we're moving forward, this is a good question as well. Is it better to be extremely specific to the events that can trigger a force majeure based on your venue details? Obviously, courts don't like vague language. So can you kind of hit on that a little bit about restrictive language we should be careful of?
Well, um, I'm not sure if you're talking about in a force majeure clause. I'm not sure what the restrictive language would be. What I think, and let me try and maybe answer your question a different way. Um, I think that planners have to sit down and think about when they're doing a contract. Here's my meeting. Is my meeting a corporate meeting where everybody has to show up basically or they get fired? It's part of the job. Is it a voluntary association where it's an optional for people to come? And then you figure out what kind of meeting you have and you decide what kind of force majeure would be relevant to your members or your prospective attendees. So if it's senior citizens, you may need, and I don't know aspersions, but maybe they don't want to go out in horrible weather. You may need a broader force majeure clause. Or if it's people who aren't used to traveling, so they get skittish if something happens, you may need a broader force majeure clause than you do if it's experienced travelers or people who are really extremely motivated to show up for the event. You're correct that courts don't like vague language, and courts tend to construe force majeure clauses pretty narrowly if they're able to. But I would put in exactly what you need. The challenge with force majeure is that we don't know what the next force majeure is going to be, right? They're unforeseen events. So you need to define it as much as possible with examples, and then add something like, or any other unforeseen occurrence beyond the control of the parties that makes it illegal, impossible, and or commercially impracticable to move forward with the event. Something to that effect. some broad language that gives you some leeway.
Excellent. Excellent. Going a little out of order. I wish I'd seen this question earlier. This is probably a quick, simple yes or no question for you. But can a venue force you to rebook versus cancel and receive a refund? Depends on the
If
contract,
it's
correct?
if it's a force majeure, yes. But here's the thing: a force majeure, a pure force majeure means that both parties walk away, so they have to refund. A venue could take a position that they don't have to do that. And in fact, what we're seeing right now are situations where, um, frankly, given the starkness of the situation in a lot of places, you ought to get your money back. If you're meeting in Las Vegas at one of the casino hotels in the beginning of April, when the casino hotel is going to be closed by order of the government, you ought to get your money back. Period. End of story. But why isn't that happening? And I don't. It's so automatically because the hotels, the venues, they want to keep your money. They are in a desperate situation. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not finding fault here. I get it. They're in a desperate situation and they need the cash, notwithstanding that they're going to get bailed out by the federal government very shortly, but they need the cash. They would rather rebook you so they can keep your money and apply it to a later meeting. The airlines, frankly, are doing the same thing. They're canceling, but they're trying to get you to take a credit rather than give you a refund, even though they've canceled your flight. What you need to insist on, if you're a planner, if you want a refund, insist on it. And if it's a real force majeure event, you should get it. Don't expect the hotel to volunteer it. And in fact, some properties are taking the position, even if it's a clear force majeure, in my opinion, what happens, they're still taking the position that it's not a force majeure. Why? Because they're trying to negotiate a better deal that lets them keep the deposits at least for a while until your rescheduled meeting comes around. But with a true force majeure, you should always have an option to get a refund, not only for you, but also for your members or attendees who may have already made a hotel reservation or paid some sort of deposit.
Excellent advice. Excellent advice. Well, man, I'm just gonna keep these questions coming on down.
Well,
Why don't we? All right. Scott asks, what if the location we're holding our event does not have any restrictions for gathering, but a number of the attendees are coming from hotspots? In this case, obviously with coronavirus, everything happening. If anyone's watching this, in 2025, you know what we're talking about. How should that be viewed when it comes to the event?
Well, it's interesting because I had this situation, frankly, until yesterday. I had a client of mine had a meeting or an incentive meeting in Mexico, and they do have the meeting in Mexico. And Mexico, as some of you may know, has been very slow to react to coronavirus. Now, there's some reason for that because Mexico does not have the same incidence so far of coronavirus that the US has and many other countries do. So their resorts are still up and running. And as a result of that, but I say this has changed because today actually, Mexico has issued some increased bans and restrictions on gatherings, and they're now into social distancing like the rest of us. But let's say we're still 3 days ago. Mexico was saying we can still have your meeting at our resorts and they're open, so it's not a force majeure, even though there are all these travel issues with getting to Mexico for people from other countries, as well as the health issues the rest of us are going on. This is why it's important to work into your clause, in your force majeure clause, words like commercially impracticable or inadvised if it becomes inadvisable to go forward with the meeting, although you ought to then define inadvisable so there's some sort of objective criteria with it in your force majeure clause. But it shouldn't, you make sure your clause isn't just limited to what's happening in the place that you're meeting. Make sure it recognizes that your attendees are getting on an airplane. And so if something happens, so they don't want to get on an airplane due to some unforeseen occurrence, that should be a force majeure and excuse performance as well.
Such good stuff, Josh. This is This is, I
You
think,
should.
such incredibly tactical advice. I think by the fact that everyone's kind of calmed down in the comments for a split second, I think everybody's very much learning a lot from this. So Kim Culver asked the exact question that I was just about to ask in the LinkedIn chat. So she says, what would you change for reviewing your terms and conditions now moving forward for events and event contracts for vendors primarily, I think is the question.
Well, and it's the same for anyone. I mean, if you're talking about after coronavirus, you got to take another look at your force majeure clauses. I deal with those all the time before this, and I've revised my standard force majeure about 4 times in the last month. Why? Because I look at distinctions between government regulations, government orders, government advisories. In this situation, I would want the CDC advisory against travel, which they issued, what, a week and a half ago? I would want that to be enough for a force majeure. But if my clause, which I frankly never thought was an issue before, said government regulation, that wasn't enough. A CDC advisory is not a regulation. So I've been taking a careful look at what that clause says. I'm also looking to see, and by the way, we call things force majeure clauses when they're really much broader than that. Some attorneys call them excuse of performance clauses because a force majeure, as I said before, lets everyone walk away. But that doesn't really work for some of you who are vendors and suppliers, right? As I said before a few minutes ago, you've put all this work in for the meeting. You've got site visits, you've got planning, you've got registration setups, you've got registration websites, you've got contracts with transportation companies, everything else. And if it's a force majeure, if we get force majeures, we hope they never happen. But if they do happen and you have to walk away, you've lost a lot of money. So if I were a vendor, I would say I would put in my contract, even if there is a force majeure, the client still needs to pay the vendor for your non-reimbursable costs and expenses that you've incurred to the time of termination. And that could include salaries for your employees, cancellation fees you have to pay your vendors, all transportation costs that you put out, all sorts of other things. So you're not out of pocket. If there's a force majeure, the hotel has empty rooms, but the meeting hasn't happened yet. The host of the meeting walks away, but third party planner and the vendors could really be out a lot of money that they spent in prep. So you want to make sure your contract covers that. So at least you're reimbursed. And I find that many meeting hosts, meeting sponsors are willing to sign a contract that pays their third-party planners and other vendors their non-reimbursable, non-refundable costs if there's any sort of cancellation. So those are the kind of things I would address.
Excellent, excellent. And I realized I misread that question, so I'm going to
Oh,
be
never
asking it
mind.
for a little. No, that was a good. Still, I was exact. I wanted to ask it anyway, so I guess I got it out. But I'm going to save that, guys, for the very end. I'm going to tease you guys for that question that you did actually ask for the very end when we do the resources and everything like that, so we give a chance. I think there's so much good stuff still coming in. I want to give a shout out to Deborah who said, "Josh, you rock." I think
That's what I'm
you're.
smiling at.
Yeah, you're with
Yeah.
all of us right now. We really appreciate you so much taking your time. I know you've been so busy doing this. So let's keep the questions coming, everyone. Leave them in the comments down below, and we'll keep them flying on in and over to Josh. So now kind of thinking about the future a little bit more as well. When it comes to, I guess, generally cancellations of events and things like that, what or sort of tips do you have for planners when it comes to their events now moving forward? When it comes to maybe not just necessarily contract language, but general cancellation tips and things like that.
Okay. Well, the first thing that we've learned, which I've been saying for forever, but read your contracts. Know what you're getting yourself into before you sign the contract, and think about what could happen. I hope nobody who's listening to this has ever had a bad experience. Realize you're talking to the lawyer who I'd like to think people call me because they like me, but 90% of my calls are because someone's had a bad experience or they're preventing a bad experience by proactively. So I hear everything. Um, think about what could happen with your meeting. Think about, in your experience, what's happened in the past. Make sure your contracts address all those things. Make sure, if you're a third party planner or a vendor, your clients have reasonable expectations about what you can deliver. Um, with your hotel contracts, if they're way off in the future, think about unpredictability, not just a force majeure, but what if, as some people are saying, we've had a seller's market. What if we're heading to a buyer's market? So rates are going to go down. Do you have some way to protect your groups and yourself so that your rates, if rates go down in the area generally where you're having your meeting, your rates for your meeting aren't going to be stuck at some high rate because you signed a contract a year earlier before rates went down and now you're stuck. Um, I would think about, again, we're in uncertain times. I've always recommended there be a hotel quality clause in the contract that says essentially the hotel shows us a website, or we've gone on a site visit. We see what condition the hotel is in, and we expect the hotel to be in the same condition or better at the time of our meeting, if it's a year or two away, or even more, a few years away. Why is that important? Because right now we're in an uncertain period. Hotels may not have the capital that they've had in the past few years to renovate and do upkeep. And you want to have some remedy if the property is not where it ought to be and where your reasonable expectations are at the time when your meeting rolls around. So again, a lot of proactive thinking about what could happen, using your experience. And just one or two other really quick tips: make sure you understand what's in your contracts. If you don't understand them, if there's a lot of legalese, a lot of reference to statutory provisions, and you don't understand them, ask the properties, even if ever non-hotel contracts, ask your vendors. Um, Remember when we were discussing privacy, GDPR, California's privacy laws, all sorts of things that were important before coronavirus came up? They're still going to be important. Cybersecurity, anti-hacking, security of the internet and your networks in the property, all sorts of things to think about to make sure your contracts address them. And particularly if you're paying the hotel or a third party vendor to have secure web access during your meetings, they ought to warrant and take responsibility if things happen. So nothing to do with coronavirus. Refreshing, right? For a minute to talk about something else, but all sorts of things to think about putting in your contracts.
I think it's so awesome for you to say, like, yeah, keep in mind, guys, there was all these things happening before all of this. That's still important, and we still need to be looking at that, because when,
Yeah,
hopefully this all clears up and everything's good to go and we're
and it
back to
will.
business as normal, those things are going to now be there. But this is the time to be working on them too, because now we don't have as many clients working on things like that. We have time, which is incredible. Okay,
Right.
so two more questions, I think, before we go into our final wrap up questions. So, Gerardo Hernandez Aguilar, I want to say your full name this time. I hope you don't mind. Asked, how can we talk to our clients? What's the best approach for talking to our clients to help them avoid cancellation?
Well, do we know if this person is a hotel person?
Uh,
Uh,
Meeting planner, event
oh, a
planner. Yeah,
planner.
maybe. So maybe
Well,
directly with the business.
okay, so it's a little tough right now because, let's face it, coronavirus is the only thing anyone's talking about in the news, and it's the only thing attendees are seeing in the news. And if a meeting is not going to happen, there's probably, because the people don't want to go, there's little you can say. But this is a rare situation. Usually it's something less. So let's take another situation that's come up, that frankly is not a force majeure event. There might be a state law that's enacted in a place that you want to have that you're planning to have your meeting, that people don't like. A law that people see as discriminatory, as anti-LGBTQ, some law that people don't like. And people say, that state, they're bigots in that state. I don't feel comfortable going forward with that meeting. Those are those kind of situations that have often come up. Again, it seems like a long time ago, but they come up pretty frequently now. In those situations, the key is communication between the planner or the hotelier and the client. What to mitigate the issues. So, for instance, maybe the state has passed a law that you think is discriminatory against gay people or what have you, but the hotel doesn't subscribe to that law. The hotel's told us, we've talked to them about it. It's not that they're violating the law, but they are don't agree with it, and they don't do anything to implement that rule if they can do that legally. And then sometimes you have to say to your client, if you do cancel, you're going to pay damages, and let them know up front that it's unlikely you're going to be able to negotiate away paying cancellation damages, which frankly is usually the case. If you want to cancel for something that's not a force majeure, you're going to pay cancellation damages. And to me, talking to the client, letting them know the downside often helps the situation. Not always. There are some groups that people feel so principled that they say, even if we lose $200,000, we're not going forward with a meeting in this state because they've said it's okay not to make a birthday cake for a minority person, what have you. If that's the situation, and they're willing to lose the money, there's nothing you can do. But just fill them in on the consequences, on the consequences of cancellation, and B, what can be done to sort of mitigate the effects of whatever it is they're squeamish about going forward with the meeting about.
Excellent advice. Excellent advice. And I think it's important too to look at the parallels between what's happening now and thinking about it not hyper specifically just to coronavirus, but also in the moving future. So I'm really glad you brought up those analogies as well. I got one last question before I jump into our standard kind of last couple of questions. Terry Quick asks, essentially, there's a lot of vendors out there. A lot of them have been having people pay deposits. Now they're having trouble collecting fees. So how would you suggest changing the deposit clause so they get paid? But better advice is, if a client or a vendor is having trouble getting paid, what's the best mode of action and what sort of processes would you take in place in order to get paid and make sure that they're getting their payment?
Okay, so this is a really good question, because I mean, is there anybody out there right now who is owed money, who isn't in this industry, who isn't concerned about getting paid? It impacts everybody. Unfortunately, it's a little late to think about this. And by the way, Terry, I'm not faulting you, because I think about the same thing. I think the lesson for what's already there for your deposits, it's what it is. If someone owes you a deposit and they haven't paid you, you have to think about how to cut your losses. So you say to the client, look, we're going forward with the meeting at this point. You're late with your deposit. And most contracts say this anyway. If you don't pay us within 5 days of when it's due, we have the right to cancel the meeting and keep your deposits. If you don't have something like that in your contract, you should. If you do have something in your contract like that, think about enforcing it more than maybe you otherwise would, because right now things are very uncertain. If you, again, it's tough to deal with this after the fact, because a lot of us work on, and me too, we work on relationships, and you maybe extend credit to your clients or push back deposits because it's never been an issue. There's not much you can do about that, either if they don't owe you, if they don't owe you yet. Now, if they do owe you and haven't paid, besides cancellation, the only remedy you have is to take them to court, which isn't going to get you anywhere quickly. Number one, most courts, at least in the US, aren't operating right now except on an emergency basis. And two, it takes time. So you don't want to go there. If you find you're in a situation where someone owes you and they're not paying, besides court, I would talk to them and see, say, look, maybe you want to settle it for 70 cents on the dollar, whatever it is, if you don't think that they're going to otherwise pay you. It's really on a case by case basis, and learn the lesson. For your future clients, insist on more payments up front. So you're not losing out. And so if you have expenses in particular, even including your employee expenses, or you have to pay others for equipment, things that you need, if the client doesn't make a deposit payment, you're not losing money. You get the deposits in such a schedule, so it's before you have to make major expenditures. And other than, if none, hopefully some of that's helpful, but again, it's lesson learned. I hope it's not lesson learned for a lot of us, but I think it will be, just because of this unanticipated nature of what we're going through right now.
Absolutely. There's so much changing so fast right now.
Yeah.
Everyone, thank you guys for watching. We got couple more questions left, so hang on in there. Do want to give a shout out to Mark, who said, thank you, Josh, for all the amazing information. Seriously, so awesome. And if you're enjoying this chat right now, let Josh know by giving a thumbs up, give a like, smash the applause button on LinkedIn, or put a heart emoji, whatever you want to do. Go ahead and give that reaction, just so then Josh knows that getting that love on there as well. So last two questions that I have for you. Let's start with the first one. If you had to pick one single tip, I guess, and we'll keep it, I guess, more legal, but not necessarily just cancellation, but legal advice, not legal advice, but yeah, you know what I'm saying. If you had to give one tip for planners out there when it comes to the legalese of events, what would be your one tip for everybody?
Okay, well, since I've already given you one of the one tips, I'm going to give you a different one. The one I've already given you is to read your contracts before you sign them, and then after you sign them if something comes up, so you know exactly what you're getting into, and then you know what your rights are if something comes up. The other thing, and this goes against lawyerly instincts, but is to remember that the people you're contracting with, or the companies you contract with for meetings, are your meeting partners. They're not just negotiating adversaries. Why? Because it isn't like when the contract's over, when you've negotiated and signed the contract, you're just delivering something like an Amazon package and you're done. These are people who you're planning meetings with. You need your hotel partners to help you execute a successful meeting that will first of all, keep your clients happy, but keeping your attendees happy. The same goes with your vendors, with your AV people, with any other, your transportation vendors, everyone else. They are your partners to a successful meeting. So this is one of the areas where lawyers like to beat the other side, but a scorched earth policy, a win at all cost policy, like in litigation, doesn't necessarily work in this. And you need to remember that once your negotiating for your contracts is done, you need to work with the other side the other person you're negotiating with is a partner. So that's my one bit of advice. Then if they don't do what you want to do, you hire a lawyer, you do something else, and you go at them with full gusto if they haven't met their obligations. But before you get to that point, figure out a way to get through contract negotiations so you can still work together.
Awesome. I love it. I love it. Lots of praise coming in the chat. Pierre Berliner says, this was so great. Will and Josh, thank you. It's all Josh, not me. Don't look at me.
No.
Josh is doing all the dropping knowledge.
And this is different for me. I've done nothing for the last 2 weeks than having people yell at me as to either why they can't cancel their contracts or why I should let them cancel without paying anything. So this is a refreshing thing to get a few compliments.
That everyone's giving you compliments. Well, also Deb also says, very awesome talk. TJ says, thank you, Josh. Thank you, guys. Well, we got one last question for you, Josh. For favorite resources, places that you go to stay on top of things. Obviously, law school is probably a big resource, but what sort of resources do you like to stay tuned to and stay on top of?
Yeah, although the one thing I think they're missing at law school, I'm missing a lot in law school, but one thing is there's no hospitality law course in law school. I taught for several years as an adjunct at Temple University here in Philadelphia, which has a hospitality and tourism program. So they teach it at other levels, but not at law school. But to keep abreast of things, of course, there's all the industry media and industry news, but there's no substitute for talking to people, all of you who are doing this and doing this on a daily basis. So MPI and PCMA, and I think ASAE all have blogs, for lack of a better way to put them. They have people listservs. People write questions in, and other people who are members answer the questions. I read those daily. There's a lot of questions now about cancellation, obviously, but I see what people are thinking about because I read them. Sometimes I contribute responses to them, not always, but that's where I see where people are talking. The other thing is I get out there. I do a lot of speaking, frankly, live speaking when we're not in this situation for, again, MPI, Meetingsnet, Connect, PCMA, other groups, and just talking to planners. And even in a forum like this, I now know what people who are planning meetings and meeting vendors are thinking on the ground. Sitting in a law office, I don't know this stuff. You just have to be out there and talk to people and listen to what concerns them. So that's really the best thing, the way to keep abreast of what's going on.
I love it. I think that, yeah, far too many people kind of expect the information to come to them, but sometimes you just have to go out and talk to your customers. In this case, it's planners,
Absolutely.
vendors, and when you talk to them and hear from them, they're going to tell you exact questions. We did a webinar like last or 2 days ago, and I was wondering what more questions people had about virtual events. I took all the questions everyone submitted and put them all in one document. I said, okay, I answered this. Okay, we have this on this. Oh my gosh, I never thought about this question. Oh my gosh, I never thought about this question. And it came from you guys. So that's why we do this show and we love it. Well, Josh,
Yeah.
I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Josh, this was so incredibly valuable. Literally, Katie saying, thank you, so important. Janice is saying, wonderful information. Mark Howell saying, great information. Scott Weiner, helpful, guys, thanks. Seriously, everyone out there, thank you guys for tuning in. But Josh, especially because you're so busy right now, thank you for taking time out of your day and being able to go to the quiet part of the house to be able to record this show with us today.
That's right. My family's very tolerant. They're managing to live with a lawyer without going out for about 10 days now. So they get some credit here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Josh, again for coming
Thank
in. We
you.
can't wait. We're going to have to get you back on the show probably to talk more. So if you want to know more legal related things, feel free to shoot us an email, eventicons@helloendless.com. You can email us directly and we can get those questions over to Josh. And if you're tuning in live right now, make sure to subscribe at event-icons.com. That's where you're going to be able to get all the future episodes, all the downloads, and also the recording of this. So if you want to re-listen to it to get some more thinking, you can do that all day long. Well, I have two last questions I'm going to give for you, Josh, on here. First question is, if people want to get a hold of you and talk to you, what's the best way for people to reach you?
Best way to do that is probably by email at this point. My email address is grimesj@grimeslaw.org. That's GRIMESJ at GRIMESLAW.org. I get questions from people all the time. I got a lot going on now. You could always email me, understanding that just like in this session now, I can't give legal advice out without a formal relationship, but I'm happy if anyone actually has that need to get in touch with me.
I love it. I love it. And I know this is a hard question to ask, but I think that I know that I've obviously talked to my attorney before, and they say it's always good to come to you before everything happens because you'll pay less than you will afterwards. But for people who are looking at getting contract revisions and things like that, how can people kind of visualize what it might cost to do this? Obviously, costs are tight, but
Yes.
is that just hey, you got to hit up Josh and get a quote sort of thing? What's the best way for people
Yes,
to think about that?
I think that's probably the best way to do it, is to get in touch with me. This is like anything else. There are forums out there, and often people go onto the industry blogs I just talked about, and they ask people for clauses. I think for professionals, this is where you get what you pay for. Some of these resources, by the way, are out there. Many of the industry professional organizations have form contract clauses, and they're better than nothing, although I don't think they're great. But I think the best answer is, a lot of people are updating contracts now. I get a lot of calls and emails from people who want to talk about doing that. Contact an attorney that you're comfortable dealing with and that you think knows what they're doing. and ask them, and most of them will give you, as I would give you a good sense of what it would cost. I would look at it as an investment rather than a cost, because particularly if you do a form contract or addendum, you can use it over and over again.
Absolutely. If you think about how many contracts we send out on a daily basis, I mean, for just take a percentage of each of those, put it in a savings account, and then there you go, to be able to afford having an official looking contract. Not even official looking, but official, legit contract. Josh, I got to thank you one more time. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been fantastic. Thank you to the live audience for watching today, and everyone who's watching afterwards as well. You guys know what to do. Hit us up, shoot us an email, subscribe today, and make sure to stay on top. We got tons of Event Icons content hitting live. We're doing so many emergency broadcast episodes these coming weeks. Get it on out there and connect with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys all next week on Event Icons. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for another amazing episode of #Event Icons. To catch all the bonus content, resources mentioned, and an invite to our Facebook and LinkedIn groups, head to www.event-icons.com. Also, let us know what you thought about this week's episode. Share your biggest takeaway. Just tag your post with #Event Icons. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, right here on #Event Icons.